Will the truth be buried or exposed? Imagine yourself in a courtroom, but not as a spectator. You're the accused. The entire room is dead silent, so silent that you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your chest. The air is cold. Every gaze in the room is locked onto you, some filled with smug satisfaction, others with confusion. But not a single person dares to stand by your side. Yesterday, you were a model police officer. Today, you are a traitor. Alex Carter lifts her head, eyes unwavering despite the trap tightening around her. Standing before her is Inspector Wallace, a seasoned veteran, a cunning fox in the system. Arms crossed, he smirks. He doesn't need to hide anymore. This system belongs to him. This game is his. Inspector Alex Carter, you are charged with bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. We are placing you under immediate arrest. Everything falls apart. A uniformed officer steps forward, hand reaching for the cuffs. But then, the courtroom doors slam open. A man strides in, his icy gaze sweeping across the room. In his hand, a thick stack of files. And then, he speaks the words that freeze everyone in place. Put the cuffs down. You're arresting the wrong person. And just like that, everything shifts. Who is pulling the strings? Who is the puppet? And most importantly, who is about to be exposed? The truth is coming. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next shocking twist. Part 1. The darkness behind the doors of justice. The clock on the courtroom wall struck 11 p.m. The second hand moved forward in a silence so thick it felt suffocating. No one spoke, not a single sound, except for the faint tapping of a pen against the wooden desk and the shallow breaths of those present. The pale fluorescent light cast an eerie glow over the cold, tiled floor, reflecting off tense faces that watched every movement in the room with quiet anticipation. This was no ordinary trial. No press, no public, no flashing cameras eager to capture every moment of a scandalous case. Only a select few, handpicked for this moment, sat on the stiff wooden benches, silent spectators, like vultures waiting for their prey to fall. Alex Carter sat upright, her hands clasped together on the table, her deep black eyes revealing nothing. The dark blue uniform still fit her slender but strong frame. Yet here, in this room, the badge she once wore with pride felt like a target, just waiting to be ripped away. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't afraid. She had seen this coming. This was a trap. Across from her, Inspector Wallace leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, one hand resting on the desk while the other tapped out an invisible rhythm. He looked harmless, just a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and thin silver-rimmed glasses that added to the illusion of an honorable officer. To the untrained eye, he was the very image of justice, an officer who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. But Alex knew better. She had seen the shadows behind his polished exterior, the cases that had been buried, the statements that had been altered, the names that had vanished from internal records, the officers who had dared to speak up, only to find themselves either out of a job or gone without a trace. She had gathered enough evidence, enough to understand that Wallace wasn't just another corrupt cop. He was the system itself, a rotting foundation disguised as righteousness. And tonight, as she sat across from him in this secret courtroom, she knew this was only the beginning of the real battle. A uniformed officer stepped forward, placing a thick folder in front of her. The bold red stamp on the cover read, "Classified, internal use only." Wallace adjusted his glasses, a faint smirk curling at his lips, the smirk of a man who controlled the board. Inspector Carter, his voice was deep, each word delivered like a predetermined verdict. "Do you know why you're here tonight?" Alex lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes without a hint of hesitation. Her voice was steady. "Because you don't want me walking out of here as a police officer." Wallace tilted his head slightly, the smirk widening, as if amused that she had seen right through him. "Smart. But the problem is Carter." He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're too smart for your own good." A soft click echoed through the room as he opened the folder, spreading its contents across the table. Evidence. Photos. Receipts. Witness statements. A story was being painted. A story where Alex Carter was guilty of bribery, obstruction of justice, and abusing her power during an internal investigation. She didn't flinch. She had expected this. Wallace leaned in, his voice a low whisper laced with authority. You're not just looking at being fired, Carter. If I were you, I'd start thinking about how many years you'll be spending behind bars. Murmurs spread across the room. A few pairs of eyes turned toward Alex, waiting for her reaction. But she remained unmoved. Fascinating, Wallace, she said, her voice slow and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a blade. You have quite the elaborate case built up, but there's just one problem. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. Her voice dropped lower, filled with quiet power. It's all fake. A heavy silence fell over the room. Wallace blinked, but his smirk didn't falter. Denying it won't save you. I'm not denying anything, Alex replied smoothly. She tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she had already solved. I'm just curious, how long did it take you to put this all together? For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Wallace's face. Alex had hit a nerve. And then, the courtroom doors burst open. A rush of cold air swept through the room, making the fluorescent lights flicker. All eyes turned toward the entrance. And there he was. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the dim corridor. In his hand, he held another folder, thicker, older, but carrying something Wallace never expected to see. A seal from the Department of Justice. The man stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Apologies for the delay. His cold eyes scanned the room before settling on Wallace. But it looks like I arrived just in time to set the record straight. And in that moment, the game changed. Part 2. The Justice Trap, the Ruler and the Sacrificed. The air in the courtroom grew thick, suffocating. Silence was no longer just an empty void. It was a double-edged sword hanging over Alex Carter. Every eye in the room was waiting for a verdict, a rebellion, or a collapse. And then it happened. Wallace pushed back his chair and stood, drawing all attention to himself. Under the harsh white lighting, he looked like a supreme judge, a man with absolute power, a seasoned wolf who knew exactly how to control a crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an important announcement. His voice rang out, smooth and cold, every word rehearsed to perfection. Alex clenched her fists onto the table. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was the moment he would spring his trap. Tonight, we are not merely trying a simple case, Wallace continued, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Tonight, we will expose a traitor, someone who has exploited the name of justice for personal gain. A murmur spread through the room. Alex's face remained calm, but deep inside, she knew the storm had arrived. Wallace pulled out another file, holding it up like it contained undeniable proof. He slid it toward the judge, but his gaze never left Alex. Inspector Alex Carter, you are accused of accepting bribes, concealing evidence, and obstructing an internal police investigation. This time, the room erupted. Whispers, stolen glances, silent exchanges between officers seated nearby. Alex could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Anyone who had been on her side was now stepping away. She glanced quickly at her colleagues, people she had fought alongside, people she had risked her life for. They averted their eyes. I don't need to hear any more, Wallace declared. His voice was final, like a blade slicing through the air. Arrest her. Alex shot to her feet. This is a setup. Her voice was strong, unwavering. But the room no longer looked at her with trust. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others remained silent, unwilling to be dragged into this. She looked around. No one stood with her. Just hours ago, she was a respected inspector. Now, with one calculated twist of the system, she was no different than a criminal. Wallace narrowed his eyes. The false warmth he once carried was gone. Did you really think you could beat me? He asked. Alex held his gaze. I don't need to beat you, Wallace. Her voice was razor-sharp, each word cutting through the doubt in the air. I just need the truth to come out. A heavy silence stretched across the room, thick as smoke. And then Wallace laughed, a low, mocking chuckle that grew into a deep, satisfied laugh. No one dared to interrupt him. Even the judge remained still, as if he could not, or would not, intervene. Wallace's laughter faded into a smirk. What a shame, Carter. You had potential, but you never learned when to bow down. Then he moved toward her. No one in the room stopped him. Alex didn't flinch. She knew what he was about to do, but she also knew he would never see her break. Wallace stopped right in front of her, his voice dropping to a low whisper just for her ears. This is how I deal with those who refuse to play by my rules. Thud! A sharp pain shot through her stomach as Wallace drove his knee into her. The force sent her stumbling backward, her back slamming against the edge of the table. A few sharp gasps echoed across the room. She gritted her teeth, hands pressing against the table to steady herself. Her vision swam for a second, but no matter how much it hurt, she did not fall. Wallace tilted his head, amused, relishing his power. He wasn't afraid of consequences, because he knew no one in this room would dare to speak up. Cuff her. This time, two officers stepped forward. One of them grabbed her arm roughly, snapping the cold metal cuffs around her wrists. She didn't resist, not because she was defeated, but because she knew this wasn't over. But just as they started to drag her away, a voice cut through the tension. A voice that was sharp, cold, and filled with authority. Let her go. The entire room froze. Every head turned toward the door. A man stepped inside. He wore a long coat, his posture relaxed, but his presence imposing. Every step he took carried a quiet menace. In his hand, another file. Thicker, older, but carrying something Wallace never expected to see. A classified seal from the Department of Justice. The man stepped forward and threw the file onto the table. The cover flipped open, revealing the words. Confidential report. Evidence of Inspector Wallace's corruption. He met Wallace's stunned gaze and smirked. Your game is over. And just like that, the fall began. Part 3. The one who defies the system. Thud. The thick file hit the worn wooden table with a sharp snap. The entire courtroom froze. All eyes, wide with shock, confusion, and disbelief, were locked onto the man who had emerged from the shadows. He was not a cop. He was not a prosecutor. He was not a part of this system. And yet, he had just placed something on the table that could bring it all crashing down. Wallace stood motionless, but only for a second. Then, he smirked, forcing himself to stay composed. So, we have another hero joining the stage, he said, his voice smooth and calculated. And who exactly are you, if I may ask? The man stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The flickering light cast harsh shadows across his sharp features. His jaw was clenched, his icy stare unwavering. But his voice was calm, deadly calm. I'm the man you tried to bury. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Alex blinked, studying him. There was something familiar about his face, but she couldn't place it. Not yet. Wallace remained still, but Alex caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. Another troublemaker, Wallace mused, still clinging to his facade of authority. And what exactly do you have to back up your grand accusations? Or is this just another cheap performance? The man said nothing at first. Instead, he slowly opened the file, reached inside, and pulled out a USB drive. He placed it on the table. Everything is in here. His voice was low, steady, absolute. Evidence of cover-ups. Dirty money. Disappeared names from internal records. It all leads back to you. The air in the room grew unbearably thick. Wallace stared at the USB for a moment. Then, he laughed. You think a tiny USB is enough to bring me down? But this time his voice wavered just slightly. Alex noticed it instantly. Wallace could not let this drive see the light of day. If the data inside was exposed, his entire empire would collapse. But Wallace was still Wallace. He wouldn't go down without a fight. I'm done with this nonsense. Wallace whipped around, his fingers snapping toward Alex. Arrest her. Now. Two officers moved in, gripping her arms tighter than necessary. She didn't resist. Not because she was surrendering, because she knew this wasn't over. Are you afraid, Wallace? Alex's voice cut through the tense air. You know that if I leave this room, All your secrets will be exposed. Wallace clenched his jaw. I fear no one. He turned to one of the officers. Take the USB. The officer reached for it. But in the blink of an eye, the stranger seized his wrist, locking the USB firmly in his grip. You can imprison people, the man said, his voice unwavering. But you cannot imprison the truth. Alex was shoved toward the exit. Eyes followed her, some filled with confusion, some with fear, and some with regret. She could see it. A few of her colleagues knew this was wrong, but no one dared to step forward. They were all part of the system. The heavy metal doors of the transport van slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed her whole as the engine roared to life. She leaned back against the cold walls, closing her eyes for just a second. She had expected this. She knew Wallace wouldn't fall so easily. But when she opened her eyes, only one thought remained. The next move, he could lock her away, but he couldn't stop her, because this war was far from over. And Alex Carter would not stop. Part 4. The Truth in the Darkness. Within the cold, gray walls of the detention center, Alex Carter remained unbroken. If Wallace thought locking her up would silence her, he had made a grave mistake. She knew the truth was still out there, buried within the system. Wallace could forge documents. He could manipulate the weak. He could turn the entire force against her. But there was one thing he couldn't do. Erase everything. Because this system was a greedy beast. It never truly discarded anything. Internal reports, illicit transactions, sealed personnel files, buried witness statements. Somewhere in that tangled mess was the key to bringing Wallace down. And Alex knew exactly where to find it. The internal database of the police department. But she needed someone on the outside. Someone who could get inside the system. Someone who was willing to take the risk. 3 days into her detention, on a stormy night, she got her answer. The heavy door to the interrogation room creaked open, and a young officer stepped inside. Ethan Hayes, a rising star in the force, one of those who had once idolized Wallace. Alex remembered the way he used to look at Wallace, as if he were a flawless role model, a man who could do no wrong. But tonight, that look was gone. Ethan sat down across from Alex, hands clasped together, hesitation flickering in his eyes. I don't know why I'm here, he muttered, voice low. Alex studied him for a moment before leaning back in her chair, her gaze sharp. You know Wallace is corrupt, she said bluntly, and you're trying to decide if betraying him is worth the risk. Ethan didn't deny it. He stayed silent, but Alex could see the war raging inside him. She decided to push him further. You thought Wallace was a legend, didn't you? Her voice dropped lower. A hero, a symbol. She let the words hang, then delivered the final blow. But the truth is, he's a murderer. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. I saw the signs, he murmured. Files disappearing, witnesses being relocated. But I never thought that he could orchestrate all of this. Alex interrupted. That he could frame me to protect himself? Ethan swallowed hard. No, he admitted. I never thought I was part of it, too. Alex held his gaze. This was the moment. He could walk away, just like everyone else. Or he could do the right thing. Her voice was steady, each word laced with quiet authority. I need you to access the internal system. Find anything tied to Wallace. Locked files, unusual money transfers, erased names. If we expose that, she continued, he won't be able to hide anymore. Ethan hesitated. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he took a deep breath and nodded. I'll do it. The breakthrough. Just 1 day later, Ethan returned. This time, his expression was tense, almost fearful. He hurried into Alex's holding cell, glancing over his shoulder before leaning in. I got in, he whispered. I found an encrypted file buried in Wallace's records. Alex's pulse quickened. And, she pressed. Ethan hesitated. And what? Alex demanded. Ethan licked his lips, the worry in his eyes unmistakable. It's a list, he finally said. A list of covered-up murders. A cold wave washed over Alex. This wasn't just about corruption. Wallace wasn't just abusing his power. He was a killer. And if this list got out, he was finished. Alex exhaled slowly. Good, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Now we just have to get out. But before she could say anything else, the alarm blared. The entire detention center flashed red. Someone had discovered them. Ethan shot to his feet, eyes wide. Shit, they know I accessed the system. Alex didn't hesitate. We have to move. Now. But before they could react, the cell door swung open. Two officers marched inside. One of them locked eyes with Alex, his tone devoid of emotion. Carter, you're coming with us. Alex immediately understood. This wasn't a transfer. It was an execution order. Wallace had decided to eliminate her. Ethan's hands tightened into fists, but before he could react, Alex subtly shook her head. Don't do anything stupid, she whispered. Just get that list out. Ethan's jaw tightened as he watched her being dragged away. Alex knew this might be the last time she walked out of a room alive. But she also knew one thing. This time, she had a chance to take Wallace down. Would Alex survive? Would Ethan succeed in exposing Wallace? Don't miss the next chapter, the final showdown between Alex and Wallace. Part 5. The final showdown, justice or power? Footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor. The wailing alarm sliced through the air like a death knell. Alex ran. She sprinted through the winding paths of the detention center, her heartbeat pounding like a war drum in her chest. For years, she had hunted criminals. Tonight, she was the one being hunted. But there was one thing Wallace didn't know. She wasn't just prey. She was the predator, and she was hunting the truth. Ethan had managed to send the decryption code before being discovered, which meant they had what they needed to bring Wallace down. Now, she just had to get out alive. Behind her, two officers were closing in, guns drawn. Carter, stop right now, or we will open fire. She had no choice. Alex barreled toward the steel door at full speed, throwing her entire weight against it. Crash! The lock snapped, the door slammed open, and she stumbled into the alleyway beyond. And then she saw it. A black van parked at the end of the alley. Ethan had kept his word. No hesitation, Alex bolted. The moment she dove inside, the door slammed shut, bullets whizzing past just inches from her head. Ethan hit the gas. The van lurched forward, disappearing into the shadows of the city. Inside, Alex leaned back, gasping for breath. Do we have it? She asked, her eyes still locked on the road ahead. Ethan lifted the USB drive, his lips curling into a grin. Not just that. I sent a copy to the National Police Summit. Alex closed her eyes for a brief second, then snapped them open, steeled and ready. Then it's time to end this. The National Police Summit, where the highest-ranking officers and policymakers gathered, where power dictated justice. Today, Wallace was set to receive a promotion, a position that would make him untouchable. He walked into the grand hall, his tailored suit crisp, his demeanor poised, but his eyes glowed with victory. No one could stop him now. Or at least, that's what he thought. As Wallace took the stage, preparing to accept his final step toward invincibility, the doors burst open. Alex Carter walked in, alive, determined, and carrying the evidence that would destroy him. Gasps rippled through the hall. Officers turned in shock. Some looked horrified, others guilty. Wallace froze. Arrest her, he roared. But no one moved, because Ethan had struck first. The giant screen behind Wallace flickered, and then the video began to play. Wallace accepting bribes. Wallace covering up murders. Wallace funneling millions into private accounts. The room erupted. Shouts. Murmurs. Officers turning to each other, their faces shifting from confusion to disgust. One high-ranking official stepped forward, his voice razor-sharp. Wallace, what the hell is this? Wallace's face twisted. This is fake, he bellowed. But this time, no one believed him. Alex stepped forward, locking eyes with him. Did you really think you could manipulate the system forever? Her voice was like steel. Did you really think no one would ever stand up to you? She leaned in. What a shame, Wallace. Because your game is over. Wallace snapped. His hand darted for his gun, wild, desperate, reckless. But before he could raise it, the SWAT team stormed in. Drop the weapon, Wallace. For the first time, Wallace looked afraid. He glanced around. No allies. No protection. No escape. In one last, futile act of defiance, he lifted the gun. Bang! A single shot tore through his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Blood seeped through his suit. But the pain in his body was nothing compared to the realization that he had lost. Officers swarmed him, slamming cuffs around his wrists, dragging him up like a common criminal. He thrashed, still trying to fight. I controlled this system for 20 years. You think you can erase me? Alex stood above him, watching as he was hauled away. His screams faded into the chaos. Her voice was quiet but firm. No one is untouchable, Wallace. She let that sink in before adding, not in the system I'm about to rebuild. 3 days later, Alex Carter walked back into the police department. This time, every gaze that followed her was different. No more doubt, no more fear, only respect. Ethan approached, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. So, you actually did it. Alex exhaled, glancing at the office doors of the new administration. She knew there was still so much left to fix. She turned back to Ethan, a slow smirk of her own forming. No, she corrected. I'm just getting started. Justice has prevailed, but the fight isn't over. Hit that subscribe button to follow Alex Carter's next mission, because justice doesn't come easy. You have to fight for it.